We begin with a terror attack in the Jordan Valley today. According to the IDF, at least 3 people were wounded in a terror shooting this morning as a terrorist shot at a bus traveling along Route 90. IDF soldiers in the area arrived at the scene and began pursuing the terrorist, who shot in the direction of multiple vehicles, injuring 2 men and a 13-year-old child, with one of them seriously wounded. According to Mada Rescue Services, the boy wounded was on a bus full of school children, and he was hit by shrapnel and has a minor injury. The attack left multiple buses damaged, sparking outrage and condemnation from the bus drivers' organization, echoing calls for enhanced security measures in the region. Day 174 of the war in Gaza, IDF troops eliminated a number of terrorists over the past day using precise airstrikes. Meanwhile, the IDF discovered a significant tunnel network in the Al Amal neighborhood of Khan Yunis amid a new offensive in the area. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
With the IDF largely in control of Gaza, Hamas' ability to fire rockets has been severely hampered. Within minutes of a rocket attack on Kisufim in southern Israel, an IDF airstrike took out the terrorist who fired the rocket. The rocket fell in an open area without causing injury or damage. Meanwhile, the IDF has discovered a significant tunnel network in the Al Amal neighborhood of Khan Yunis amid a new offensive in the area. Intelligence from interrogated terror operatives led the army to 3 previously undiscovered tunnel shafts. The IDF operated in Al Amal last month and returned earlier this week, following intelligence that Hamas was using civilian sites in the neighborhood, including a hospital, for terror activity. The 98th Division continues to conduct precise operational activities to eliminate terrorists and seize weapons in the area. The IDF also continued to conduct precise operational activities in the Shifa hospital in Gaza City while preventing harm to civilians, patients, and medical teams and equipment. The troops have continued to eliminate terrorists and locate terrorist infrastructure and weapons. With chances of a ceasefire fading, there are signs that Israel is preparing for a potential operation in Rafah. The IDF carried out precise strikes on terrorist targets in and around the city.
They deny the kidnapping of our children, the murder of our grandchildren, the rape of our daughters. The new Nazis we face today will stop at nothing to destroy civilization as we know it. The World Jewish Congress was created exactly for these times like this, so every Jew can fall asleep at night knowing they are safe in their own home. We are a voice for the Jewish people everywhere. We are the World Jewish Congress.
And with hostage for truce talks apparently at an impasse, Israel is reportedly planning a Rafah incursion possibly as early as the middle of next month. The ground operation would be accompanied by an evacuation of the civilian population sheltering in Rafah. More from ILTV's Devo Klein.
Reports from the Arab world indicate that the IDF offensive in Rafah will start after Ramadan and will last between 1 and 2 months. Eid al-Fatr, the 3-day holiday that follows Ramadan, ends around April 12th. The reports say that Israel will notify Egypt before entering the Philadelphia route along the Egyptian border. The ground incursion would be accompanied by an evacuation of the civilian population sheltering in Rafah toward the center of the Strip along specific routes and at specific times, announced to civilians in each area of the city in advance. According to a report in the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. is arguing that the Rafah operation be carried out in stages, one area of the city at a time, to avoid harming the civilian population. Some 1.5 million people are currently sheltering in Rafah after safely moving from other areas on IDF instruction. 4 Hamas battalions remain in Rafah, and it is believed that Hamas leadership and at least some of the Israeli hostages are in the city bordering Egypt. The mass evacuation would be monitored from the ground and the air to ensure that no Hamas fighters or Israeli hostages are hidden among the Gazan civilians as they move to the new safe zones. Cairo expressed its deep concerns over an IDF operation in the Rafah area, noting that it could lead to a further escalation not only in Gaza, but in the entire region.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
And joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, David Benjamin. Hi, thank you so much for coming in.
Pleasure to be here.
David, Netanyahu has already approved plans for an operation in Rafah. We know that they exist, they're ready to go, but there are many international and diplomatic pressures, certainly from the United States as well. What is your assessment of this situation? What should Israel do at this point?
Well, I think it's pretty clear militarily what the advantage would be for Israel of going to Rafah sooner rather than later, because it involves maintaining the momentum of the operation. If everything now has to go on the back burner, that gets complicated for the IDF, stagnation, stuck in the mud, etc. But at the same time, Israel must listen to its allies. We need to show them the utmost gratitude and respect. That's, of course, particularly the United States, but also other allies, the UK, in Europe. We have to hear them out. We have to hear what they have to say. Even if we're not sure they'll be able to just suggest something we didn't know already, we have to do that. I think the main concern of the Americans in particular is the humanitarian aspect, and justifiably so. There are over 1 million Palestinians now concentrated in the relatively small area of Rafah.
Right.
But the IDF has shown that it does take extreme efforts, in fact, to avoid damage to civilians, in the same way that it evacuated people from northern Gaza and from parts of Khan Yunis. I'm sure the IDF has plans to do the same in Rafah. We're not just talking about a complete, total bombardment of Rafah. It would involve the same kind of strategy. I'm not sure we've succeeded in convincing our allies that we have a viable plan to do that. So maybe we're stuck there, but I believe we can get past that. We can convince them and then be able to move ahead.
So to listen to our allies, certainly the U.S. is Israel's strongest ally, best friend, if you will. But there is an Israeli delegation heading to Washington to discuss the Rafah operation. And the U.S. seems to think that there are alternatives to this full-blown operation. What could those be?
Well, I've been trying to think through what the alternatives could possibly be. So one would be just to create a sort of Hamas enclave in Rafah long term. But of course, the problem would be that would remain a Hamas enclave. It means Hamas is still on its feet and can still bounce back potentially long term. It also means the IDF will have to be engaged in Gaza much more deeply in order to contain this Hamas enclave in Rafah. Like, certainly, it's a more attractive proposition to get, well, to render Hamas neutralized altogether, not have them as players in the region. Then we can talk about the day after more effectively with a longer-term view. So it's kind of it will be a short-term solution and not a good one, not for the IDF. In fact, I don't think for the Palestinians either.
Now, what about the humanitarian situation? You mentioned this. We know there are about 1.4 million Palestinians located in the specific region of Rafah, as you mentioned earlier. According to international law, what must Israel do in order to ensure that there are no so-called war crimes, that they do ensure and engage in a way that secures these civilian lives?
Well, first of all, an operation in Rafah would not be illegal per se. In other words, it's totally legal as long as you apply the law of war. Okay, what does that mean? In a nutshell, it means you cannot attack civilians. You can only attack military targets. And the other thing is you have to maintain the principle of proportionality, which means even when you're going after the military targets, you've got to take potential civilian casualties and civilian damage into account. And if it would be out of proportion or excessive, then you can't attack. But certainly if you take the required precautions, like evacuating civilians, okay, like we've done in other parts of the Strip, will be completely legal and completely legitimate. You know, maybe not popular, but certainly in terms of legality, it would be fine.
And so looking at the general operation, the general war that has been taking place elsewhere in the Gaza Strip, we know that there are many in the world that are saying that Israel is committing war crimes, that it has not followed international law. What would you have to say to that?
Well, I would say they don't have enough information to be able to make that sort of call. Okay? In order to determine whether war crimes have been committed, one has to have proof of a deliberate attack on civilians, or else a clearly disproportionate attack on a military target which caused disproportionate harm to civilians. I don't think anyone has that information right now. I'm pretty confident because I know the IDF, and I know the IDF takes quite significant legal advice and knows how to operate according to the laws of war, and in fact goes beyond the laws of war in taking care not to cause harm to civilians. And in fact, as many civilian casualties may have been caused in Gaza, still the ratio of civilian casualties to military casualties on the enemy side, in the context of war, obviously, not in the context of peace, obviously it's shocking, but in a war, that ratio is certainly well within what's considered acceptable.
And we know that there are still 4 Hamas battalions inside Rafah, and it's suspected that many hostages are held there as well. So it's very hard to see. It doesn't seem like an operation in Rafah can be avoided.
Well, again, I mean, what you could do is besiege Rafah. I mean, remember that the sensitivity with Rafah too is because it borders Egypt. And Hamas has been substantially arming itself over the years because of that border with Egypt. You know, Israel would ideally, in order to really get control of the situation and enable a day after, which really serves everybody, would need control of that strip of the border with Egypt. So it's not just Hamas being there, it's the border too.
David Benjamin, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
In an effort to calm recent frictions between Washington and Jerusalem, the Prime Minister's office reached out to the White House to reschedule a meeting regarding an IDF operation in Rafah. At a Jerusalem meeting with visiting U.S. Congressman, Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted the need to operate in Rafah. This need has not changed. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier canceled the trip of Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and National Security Council Chair Tzachi Hanegbi after the U.S. failed to veto a U.S. Security Council vote for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Netanyahu has said the cancellation was a message to Hamas that Israel would not bow to international pressure regarding the war in Gaza. U.S. officials are now working on a new date for the meeting due to discuss the Rafah operation.
The Prime Minister's office has agreed to reschedule the meeting dedicated to Rafah. So we're now working with them to find a convenient date that's obviously going to work for both sides. But his office has agreed to reschedule that meeting that would be dedicated to Rafah, which is a good thing.
Speaking to AIPAC and a bipartisan congressional delegation, Netanyahu said victory in Gaza was close.
That's victory. Victory is within reach. It's a few weeks away. Now we are told, this is it, last point. Now we are told, you can't do this. If you go into Rafah, you're going to have a humanitarian catastrophe. You're going to have, 30,000 civilian dead. Okay. That's not true. That is simply not true.
Netanyahu said Israel will take care not to harm the civilian population.
They have a place to move. We'll make sure they have it. We make sure they have shelters. We make sure they have water. We make sure they have food, medicine, field hospitals, and so on. So this is almost a mass hysteria that has been built wrongly, that we cannot finish the job. We have to finish the job. It would be like leaving part of the Nazi army in place and saying, well, don't go there, don't leave a quarter of the German army in place and don't go into Berlin. It's not going to happen. And we have no choice because our very existence is on the line.
The Prime Minister expressed the hope that Washington and the U.S. remain on the same page.
We've had a remarkable alignment. Not without differences, not without discussions, but we've been able to overcome them since the beginning of the war with President Biden and his team. We have a difference on this. And I'm very open about it. I say, look, we have no choice, And Joe Biden is open with me. He says, I don't want you to go in. I don't want you to take a major ground operation. I say, and we've had these differences.
In Washington, U.S. officials held what were called constructive meetings with visiting Defense Minister Gallant, and that Rafah was a key topic of discussion.
They were constructive discussions with Israel's defense minister over the last 2 days. Rafah was one of the many topics discussed with Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, and Bill Burns.
In recent developments, released Israeli hostages recount harrowing experiences during their time in captivity in Gaza. For the first time this week, Amit Susana, one of the women who were released from Hamas captivity last November, spoke out and revealed that she was sexually assaulted and abused by her Hamas guard during her time in captivity. Louis Har, who was rescued by the IDF after 129 days in captivity, now reveals more detail about his captivity as well. Devo Klein reports.
In an interview to the Daily Mail, 71-year-old Louis Har described how he and his family were brutally taken from their homes on October 7th and how they were treated like animals. According to his testimony, the terrorists did not see or treat them as human beings, just objects to be used and discarded. Har recounts being in the dark for several months, surviving on scraps of food and sleeping on paper-thin mattresses. He was constantly moved from place to place, never knowing what would happen next. In some instances, his captors threatened him with a knife. In others, they mocked him and made inappropriate remarks. This comes after 40-year-old Amit Susana bravely revealed accounts of sexual abuse during her captivity by Hamas in Gaza. In an interview to the New York Times this week, Susana described how she was held alone, chained up in a child's bedroom in the dark, where she was forced to commit sexual acts for her Hamas captor. She recounted he attacked her while she was briefly unchained in order to use the bathroom. Though sexual abuse by Hamas was widely discussed, Susana's testimony marked the first time a released female hostage publicly revealed having been sexually assaulted in captivity. These accounts shed light on the brutality faced by the Israeli hostages during their captivity. While these hostages have returned, there are currently 134 others who still remain in captivity.
Horrible. And joining us now is Rabbi Dov Lipman, former Knesset member and founder and CEO of Yad Le'olim. Rabbi Lipman, thank you for joining. I'd like to discuss the current draft law. We have many international viewers who don't quite understand the source of conflict in this country, as this is an internal issue. Could you briefly explain what is this law, why is it being renewed, and why the conflict?
Absolutely. So Israel has a mandatory draft law which says that every person, when they turn 18, they must serve in the military. But going back 75 years ago when the state was founded, there were religious communities that felt that they needed to have scholars who were, during these years especially, of ages 18 to 22, 25, that they would be immersed in studying religious texts, become the future rabbis and spiritual leaders of the country. So way, way back, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, made a deal with the rabbinic leadership that there could be a few hundred young men who would get military exemptions so that they could study the Torah, the holy texts. But over the course of 75 years, those few hundred have now become over 70,000 young men that every single year are being exempt. And people have petitioned to the High Court in Israel saying this is unfair. There's a lack of equality here. Why should one population be serving in the military and others aren't? And for years, the Supreme Court in Israel has been requiring the Knesset to pass some kind of legislation that provides equality. It might not be drafting all of the ultra-Orthodox young men, but certainly higher numbers than we have at the moment. I'll just add, the recent war and the war we're involved with right now has really exacerbated the problem because we see that there is a lack of manpower in the army. We do see a need for more soldiers, so that has increased public pressure to try to get the Knesset to actually come to some kind of legislation that suffices the criteria of the court.
That's a great explanation. Thank you. There seems to be a crisis in the coalition now over the renewal of this law. How do you foresee that this will impact the government and the political arena?
So first of all, just to explain the crisis very briefly, the court required by today that there be a solution in place, or else April 1st, there will be a mandatory draft of every single young man, even those who are studying in the rabbinic seminaries, which would lead to a colossal collision of communities and an internal crisis within Israel that we haven't seen really since the state was founded. This is a much bigger one than even judicial reform would be. The government has not not come to a solution, so it asked for 24 more hours to come to one. If they don't come to one, which suffices the court, and there will be a mandatory draft, the ultra-Orthodox parties will pull out of the government. That means that Netanyahu no longer has a governing majority, which means either he has to quickly put together some kind of an emergency government or elections will be called. So for everyone watching overseas, in the midst of this war against Hamas, we have an internal crisis which absolutely, if no solution is found, could lead to the toppling of the government and the initiation of new elections in Israel.
Wow. Now, you've been involved with integration of the ultra-Orthodox sector into the workplace and the army for over a decade. Do you believe that the Haredi population could actually be prompted to serve in the army or in national service? Is there anything that can be done to engage them towards this direction?
I love the way you asked the question because you asked about the ultra-Orthodox population. I do believe that on a street level, if people were presented with options, some for military service, some for national service, let's remember, in the ultra-Orthodox population, there are already many volunteers in the areas of Magen David Adom and Hatzalah and Zaka, organizations that are playing a vital role even in this war itself. Find ways for them to serve where it won't be in the army. Let me just explain for a moment. The concern about the army is you're taking them out of their religious institutions, and now all of a sudden they're thrust at a very young age suddenly into secular society. That's where the fear lies. So first of all, presenting other options for national service, but also in the military. We've worked hard to create units that are exclusively for the ultra-Orthodox, where they have study sessions every day and prayer sessions every day, and their sensitivity to the religious needs. So I do believe working with the population, there are solutions that can be found. One of the problems is the political leadership, which seems to see their role as preserving the old way that things have been done and not willing to show any kind of compromise on this issue. So I do believe the population is open to it. I believe even many of the politicians are now open to it. We're going to have to see what happens over the course of the next few days and see if a solution can be found, or are we going to actually have a collapse of the government and a crisis in terms of going to elections during wartime, which everyone wants to avoid.
Absolutely. Rabbi Lipman, thank you so much for your analysis today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now to this. Former U.S. Senator Joe Liberman has passed away at the age of 82. Liberman was a longtime senator from Connecticut and served as Al Gore's running mate in the year 2000, making him the first Jew on a major presidential ticket. William Sharon has more.
Liberman was known for his efforts to bridge the divided and increasingly polarized Washington. His commitment to bipartisanship earned him respect across the political spectrum. Beyond politics, Liberman was also a visible role model for Jewish observance, treasuring Orthodox tradition and observing the Shabbat. Liberman often spoke about his grandparents' immigrant journey and that his heritage impacted his own path to public service. Throughout his career, Liberman remained dedicated to his principles, even when it meant facing criticism from within his own party. From extraditing President Bill Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky scandal to his steadfast support for the Iraq War, Liberman stood firm in his own convictions. His legacy as the first Jewish Orthodox candidate on a major U.S. presidential ticket will be remembered as a testament to breaking barriers. Along with many leaders and Jewish organizations, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu eulogized and tweeted, "Joe was an exemplary public servant, an American patriot, and a matchless champion of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. He is survived by his wife, his son, 2 daughters, and a stepson."
Let's take a look at the weather forecast. Mostly clear skies are expected tonight with hot temperatures, reaching lows of only 17 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow, mostly cloudy skies are expected alongside rising temperatures set to reach highs of 25 degrees Celsius or 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The warm weather should be staying with us over the weekend. And as it seems that the heat will stay with us for a while, just a quick reminder that tonight Israel is changing its clocks and getting back onto summertime. So for our Israeli viewers, don't forget to move your clocks forward tonight. That's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel on all your devices, check out our ILTV channels, subscribe to our ILTV newsletter, and don't forget to check out our new and improved website, iltv.tv, with all the latest news from the heart of the State of Israel. I'm Sivan Raviv. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.